Our first session this morning is on the evolving context of peacekeeping operations. Before I introduce the first moderator, let me first go through the rules of the game in order to save time and ensure effective participation during this conference. I will briefly introduce each of the moderators before they start their sessions. The moderators will then proceed to the podium and introduce panelists of the session by briefly taking us through an abridged version of their curriculum vitae. Panelists will be invited to take their seats on the stage, and when they are all seated, the moderator will then prompt each one of them at different intervals to give their views on the topic under discussion for about 10 minutes each. The moderator will then open up the discussion to the audience to contribute or ask relevant questions. Each session should not exceed 1.5 hours. This applies to all 4 sessions before the closing ceremony. The first plenary session is on the evolving context in peacekeeping operations, and our moderator this morning is Mr. David Harry. He's the Director of the Division of Policy Evaluation and Training at the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations. David has extensive field and UN headquarters experience related to political affairs, peacekeeping, peace building, interagency policy development. At the UN headquarters, Mr. David has served in a range of capacities in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, including as the Chief of Staff Interim, Chief of the Peacekeeping Policy and Best Practices Service, and as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary General, as well as in the Department of Political Affairs and the Office of the Secretary General. He has previously served as the UN-wide Senior Planning Coordinator for Syria and was the Director of the Joint Peace Fund for the Peace Building Support in Myanmar. His field experience includes extended deployments to Cambodia, Liberia, South Africa, East Timor, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Mr. David Harry, to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a privilege to be here today. Of course, I want to thank very much our hosts for this fantastic organization, which we're all enjoying, and also all of the co-organizers. Thank you so much for the commitment to this joint endeavor of UN peacekeeping, which your support represents, and I believe this will be yet another good preparatory step on the way to the ministerial in Ghana. I think as I prepare for this this panel, thinking at the evolving context, it struck me that it's very much of the moment. I must say, in New York, I find a lot of people asking the question, where is peacekeeping going? It's central to the Secretary General's new agenda for peace. So I think it's a very good moment for us to consider this. Obviously, there are pressures, particularly as we see the rather precipitous withdrawal of the mission in Mali. And we will also be seeing the mission MONUSCO in the DRC, as it has been already, on a transition phase. I must say, as I thought about it, though, it's important to note that peacekeeping has always adapted. The evolving context has always been changing, volatile. Peacekeeping has adapted through failure and through success. And I think we are at another junction point. Peacekeeping has adapted alongside regional organizations and other forms of peacekeeping, and I think that's also a feature today. But the one thing which peacekeeping has always required as a consent-based tool is the ability to accompany a viable political process. We're not there as an army to bend the will, ultimately, of the parties, but to provide a level of confidence so that the parties can move on the path to peace. But that confidence also needs the support at the national level, regional level, and international level of those who can provide the political, financial, and other resources necessary. And I think one of the challenges of this particular moment in the evolving context is that the political consensus at the global level, very often at the regional level, and at the national level seems to be fraying and pulling apart. And I think our peacekeeping operations suffer in that context. I once worked with Lakhdar Brahimi, the eminent UN diplomat and former foreign minister of Algeria, on Syria. And he said once, you know, the challenge is we either have to zip up from the bottom or zip down from the top. From the top level, we need clear agreement amongst the major powers. At the regional level, agreement amongst the regional powers. At the national level, amongst the protagonists of the conflict. And you can go one way or the other, but the challenge that he faced in Syria is he found at every one of those levels no consensus. So I think that that is seriously one of the aspects of the evolving context today, that when I look back to past peacekeeping moments, certainly we enjoyed probably more consensus at least one, if not all three of those levels. So this is a great moment to think about the evolving context, both historically and how we facing challenges as we roll forward. And we have an excellent panel before us, who I will invite to come to the podium as I introduce them. First, you've already been introduced to Assistant Secretary General Martha Ama Agwa-Pobe. She is an ambassador of great experience from Ghana, a career diplomat with more than 30 years in international affairs and diplomacy from the Foreign Ministry. She was Ghana's permanent representative to the United Nations, and previous to that had postings ranging from the embassy in Tel Aviv, where she was Minister Counselor and Deputy Head of Mission, Charge d'Affaires also. She served as Acting Director of the Personnel and Training Bureau and was posted also to the embassy in Moscow. And I'm sure other assignments too. I think you told me this morning you were also ambassador in South Africa, is that correct? And I don't see it here. But very, very much welcome. My Assistant Secretary General, Martha Pobe, I welcome you to the stage. Then next, let me please welcome Dr. Fonte Akum, who was appointed Executive Director of the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, this year. He takes this important organization into its 21 to 2025 strategy, building on 3 decades of growth and success that have seen the ISS expand its footprint and engagements from Southern Africa to East, Central, and West Africa. Fonte is a true Pan-African with international experience. He hails from Cameroon, educated in Africa, Europe, America, and fluent in French and English, was head of the Lake Chad Basin Program and a senior researcher in the ISS Dakar and Pretoria offices, respectively. And before joining ISS, had worked at the International Monetary Fund at its headquarters in Washington, D.C., and managed research programs at the Dakar-based Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, and has also been a researcher at the UN University for Peace Africa program in Addis Ababa, and conducted research in many parts of the continent. Has a PhD in international studies from the School of Oriental African Studies, a master's degree from American University in Washington, and also journalism qualifications thereof. So, Dr. Akum, let me welcome you to the podium. And last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce Colonel Tariq, who was commissioned in the Bangladesh Army in 1999 in the Corps of Infantry. He's a graduate from Defense Services Command and Staff College, Bangladesh, and also completed the Armed Forces War Course from the National Defense College of Bangladesh. He has served as a peacekeeper under the Blue Helmet twice in Liberia, as a contingent member in 2007 to 8, and military observer from 2014 to 15. He's also ex-faculty of the Bangladesh Institute of Peacekeeping Training Center, BIPSOT, a very important partner in our international network of peacekeeping training centers. And he has had a wide range of participation in UN peacekeeping, training matters, and other conferences and international engagements. He's currently the Colonel Staff of Overseas Operations Directorate, which is dealing with all peacekeeping operations at Army headquarters. Colonel, I welcome you to the podium. What we'll do is hear from each of our speakers, and Colonel, you'll go first, giving us some of the historical context, and then open it up for questions and comments from the floor, and alongside it, an interactive dialogue with the panelists. So, Colonel, go on to you.
Excellencies, Generals, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good morning to all of you. It's a great honor and privilege for me for getting an opportunity to be here in front of you, in front of such an august gathering. As one of the panelists, I would make an effort to discuss about the evolving context of UN peacekeeping. In doing so, I will also bring relevant aspects like Brahimi report, Hippo report, Cruz report, Action for Peacekeeping, Action for Peacekeeping Plus, and the most recent UN policy on protection of civilians as applicable in the context. To start with the evolving context of UN peacekeeping, in the early years, the aftermath of interstate conflict. In the early stage, UN peacekeepers were deployed as the aftermath of interstate conflicts to serve as a buffer between the belligerent factions and ensure compliance with the terms of an established peace agreement. Missions were consent-based and observers were often unarmed. We saw this mission just after the World War II in the Middle East and also in India, Pakistan, and Kashmir to solve the dispute between India and Pakistan. Now, the next era came in 1960s conflict, and which is defined as the era as mixture of interstate and intrastate conflicts, and also peacekeeping operations experienced some armed action, armed peacekeeping operation, which we saw the earliest armed peacekeeping operation in UN Emergency Force, UNF-1, deployed in 1956 to solve the Middle East crisis in Suez Canal. Then the operation in Congo, ONUC, it was also launched in 1960, and which is also marked as the sudden increase of peacekeepers, and also it is also marked as one of the highest death experience during that time, 250, including the Secretary General who died in a plane crash. Throughout 1960s and 70s, UN created multiple short-term missions. And these short-term missions were ranging for solving the conflict within the state, organizing the elections, and also sometimes even assume the responsibility of the state administration to promote the human rights. During this era, UN also engaged in long-term UN mission, that is in Cyprus, and also with Egypt, Israel, and also Israel and Syria. So in these two eras, no civilians were exposed. Now, the era came after the post-Cold War that may be defined as increase of intrastate conflicts and multi-dimensional peacekeeping environment. With the end of Cold War, the nature of conflicts changed over the years, and the strategic context of UN peacekeeping also changed dramatically. As such, UN has also shifted and expanded its field from traditional to multidimensional role. Between 1989 and 1994, the Security Council authorized a total of 20 new operations, rising the number of peacekeepers from 11 to 75,000 in countries like Angola, Cambodia, El Salvador, Mozambique, and so on. But this era will remain significant because within this era, the civilians were exposed first. Like in Rwanda Civil War, 1990-94, then the Slovenia, Yugoslavia, Croatia, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Iraq, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and so on. Now, as the number of civilian casualties were more due to the hostilities, the reputation of UN also had suffered. Now, to address this issue, in the second half of the 1990s, the Security Council authorized new operations in Angola, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, North Macedonia, Guatemala, and Haiti. This era would also remain significant because Department of Peacekeeping Operation also came in, and which really standardized the timely reaction of the troops contributing countries, their resource management, and also staff functioning between the field mission and also at even headquarter level. Now, after this era, then that comes the 21st century, the new operations and new challenges. As the civilians were continuously targeted, so the challenges became more. At the turn of 21st century, the UN undertook major tasks to examine the challenges to peacekeeping in 1990s and introducing a major reform. The aim was to strengthen the capacity to effectively manage and sustain the field operations. Accordingly, Brahimi report came up with clear and implementable recommendations to address the new challenges of UN peacekeeping operations in 21st century. Now, peacekeeping with most robust mandate in accordance with Brahimi report. Since the Brahimi report of 2000, peacekeeping operations have been deployed with more robust mandates and with a special focus on protection of the civilians. The report also addressed many of the resulting dysfunctions of United Nations peace and security operations, member states' accountability, and management of resources. After almost a decade in 21st century, UN peacekeeping experienced another important dimension, that is where the peacekeepers themselves were targeted. As we have seen in Mali and in DRC, where many peacekeepers laid their lives because of direct or indirect attack. However, in 2014, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon established a high-level independent panel on UN peace operations to comprehensively assess the state of UN peace operations and the challenges they face in addressing the emerging needs of the populations. In accordance to that, the HIPPO report came up and with 4 essential shifts. These are: politics must drive the design and implementation of UN peace operations. The full spectrum of United Nations peace operations must be used more flexibility to respond to changing needs of the ground, which necessitates a situation-specific response. Then a stronger, more inclusive peace and security partnership needed for the future, that is at regional and also at the international level. And finally, the United Nations Secretariat must become more field-focused, and United Nations peace operation must be more people-centered. Then after 2014 or 2015, the HIPPO report, as the peacekeepers were also targeted increasingly, Then the cruise report came up in the December of 2017, where the Santa Cruz issued the report Improving Security of United Nations Peacekeepers, which looks at concrete ways to reduce fatalities in UN peacekeeping operations. The report also deepened the conversation around peacekeepers' fatalities, while also reopening questions of whether UN peacekeepers are ready to act decisively in the face of a direct attack. Then after 2017, 2018 it comes Action for Peacekeeping, and in 2021 plus, in 2021, Action for Peacekeeping Plus. Finally, UN policy, UN Protection of Civilians Policy 2023 came up. This policy also introduced providing the conceptual framework, guiding principles, and key considerations for the implementation of protection of civilians mandates by United Nations peacekeeping operations and related support by the Department of Peace Operations. So we could just draw a line how the UN peacekeeping evolved through the ages, starting from just immediately after the World War II up to 2030. Now I'll be discussing something about the suggestive measures very briefly in regards to the protection of civilian. The protection of civilian is a national responsibility, and United Nations peace operations can play an important role in supporting the government to execute the responsibility. Along with other priorities, the UN, it must be a gender responsive protection of civilian along with child protection concerns. The tactical action should focus on operationalizing the three-tier concept, that is protection through dialogue, physical protection, and also ensuring a protective environment. When a crisis occurs, United Nations personnel cannot stand by as civilians are threatened or killed. They must use every tool available to them to protect civilians under imminent threat. Each and every peacekeepers, whether military, police, or civilian, must pass this test when crisis presents itself to himself or them. Now, August gathering, at the end, I'm quite optimistic that at the end of this preparatory conference, we would be reaching towards an implementable solution for protection of civilian, which is the most important mandated task for us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Colonel, for that very broad and useful history of the evolving context. And I think you also highlighted the range of different challenges which the UN has met. Our next speaker, I think, will also give us a little bit more insight into, in particular, the challenges which the UN has faced and is facing now, particularly in the African continent, and bring a little more insight also onto the very crucial issue of partnerships and the other peace actors who are increasingly deployed alongside us. So let me pass you the floor, Fontaine, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I would rest on existing protocols, while at the same time expressing profound gratitude to the governments of Indonesia, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Rwanda for the tremendous hospitality offered us here today. And I hope until we leave the country, we feel very Rwandan already. This is a very important convening which could not have come at a better time. And I speak to you this morning from the perspective of an applied policy research organization driven by moving towards solutions, using evidence-informed analysis, strategic convening of platforms like this one, but in extension and continuation of this one, but also through capacity enhancement as a way of driving peace and security on the continent. So, and of course, David, I mean, I've been in this role for 3 years now, which makes me a little older than one. At the same time, I think during this time, the ISS has invested itself, in fact, in understanding evolving peace operations context, and I'll build on the Colonel's presentation. His trajectory basically took us through the 75 years of UN peacekeeping. However, I would say within a more proximate time frame, recognizing the omnipresent and preponderant preoccupation with the protection of civilians and strategic communication, which are considered here for the next 36 hours. Now, our focus on peacekeeping operations is generally on the African continent for 4 serious considerations. The first is that 6 of the 12 UN peacekeeping operations and 84% of its personnel is currently deployed on the continent. And that's acknowledging the drawdown of MINUSMA and the potential drawdown of MONUSCO as well. And there's a growing commitment of both troop and civilian leadership components from Africa. And it's not news that the largest spaces where the UN is present at the moment in peacekeeping are South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The second consideration that drives us to work in peacekeeping on the continent is the observation of the political tensions that have implications for peace operations. This complexity is manifest in both multilateral, regional, and local levels, as articulated in David's point about zipping up and zipping down, intrinsically embedded in dynamics of power. Multilaterally, growing tensions among some of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are basically going to affect peace missions going forward. However, it also provides opportunities for the E10 members of the United Nations Security Council to lead on innovative areas, as we have seen with the work by Ireland and Niger on climate security, but also the commendable work by Norway and Ghana on maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea. So those are the opportunities that present themselves despite existing tensions. There is also the acknowledgement of regional ad hoc security initiatives emerging to counter terrorism, which are reshaping security landscapes. And at a local level, pockets of peace initiatives coexist with local conflicts as well and economics of violence, which were raised earlier by the Minister of Defense. Within this context, we also acknowledge the changing biological, and here we could look to the implications of the Ebola pandemic on the UN peace mission in Liberia, but more recently the COVID-19 pandemic on peacekeeping operations globally, but also the role of new technologies and social media in actually shaping the space of these operations through strategic communications, which we'll be looking at tomorrow. And understanding the context of peacekeeping operations on the African continent allows us, in fact, to foreshadow the future of UN peace operations at a time when we are actually building up to the UN Secretary General's conference, Summit on the Futures, which is built for next year. While the missions and mandates of UN peacekeeping have evolved and adapted over 75 years, they continue to register mixed results operating within increasingly complex context. And the current context underscores 5 interconnected analytical dilemmas facing UN peacekeeping missions, and effectively addressing this context-specific dilemmas, which are also political and be based on effectiveness, allows for a better understanding of how to navigate existing challenges which have been raised in the previous presentations. The first is the challenge of geographical fixity or limitations of UN peacekeeping missions within specific national borders, faced with transnational spoilers. And here we need to look at the changing nature of regional complexes of insecurity and their implications on peacekeeping operations. From the Sahel to the Great Lakes region, the complexity of regionalized insecurity systems are increasingly protracted, intractable, and adaptive, as well as transnational, which means that whatever solution you actually throw at them, they're very adept at adapting as well and navigating these cross-border spaces. Furthermore, insecurity increasingly overlaps with climate and human security challenges, and health challenges as well, as was the case during the COVID-19 pandemic. When we look to spaces like Mali and South Sudan, we see exactly the implications of changing climate patterns on UN operations rather directly. The average duration of the largest 4 UN peacekeeping missions in Africa is 11 years. These peacekeeping missions operate amid context of regionalized and regionalizing insecurity despite their nationally circumscribed postures, missions, and mandates. And in some of this context, the presence of UN peacekeepers displaces insecurity as non-state armed groups adjust their positioning and posture, often with accommodation and avoidance logics. I mean, that's what transpires through our research, and we'd have to reflect more on how to circumvent this process of eluding effective responses. UN peacekeeping missions also operate alongside political United Nations regional offices for West Africa and the Sahel, Central Africa, and the Great Lakes region, which political missions have a crucial role to play in support of, in working with, actually, peacekeeping missions. However, the constant prioritization of nationally circumscribed peacekeeping and enforcement missions to attenuate insecurity and force toward peace transitions only marginally aligns with the cross-border nature of insecurity that imperils mission staff, spawns humanitarian emergencies, imperils civilians, and undermines peace and security. The second analytical dilemma relates to local and national politics and their geopolitical tentacles. And here, within the context of elusive transitional political compact, here, UN peacekeeping missions are increasingly working in transitional context, characterized by a balance of negative forces rather than the valorization of bottom-up approaches to sustainable peace, despite tenuous coexistence. Within this context, elections might indicate a shift from bullets to ballots. However, crucial tasks of institution building, which are inclusive, remain crucial in closing the gaps in implementing effective peace agreements and building sustainable peace. The next dilemma I would raise relates to the collective security dilemmas. And here we look at issues of complementary or competing collective security arrangements in peacekeeping neighborhoods. If you look to the Sahel, for example, UN peacekeeping operations function in spaces where other ad hoc security arrangements designed to address specific cross-border security challenges often are not very coordinated and plugged in to the UN peacekeeping missions. MINUSMA, for example, in Mali was operating within a space where the G5 Sahel was functioning, and it was actually operating next to the Conseil de l'Entente, for example, which includes Burkina Faso and Niger, as an intelligence architecture trying to counter the spread of violent extremism to West Africa's coastal states. Better connection of these ad hoc security initiatives to the broader security architecture of which UN peacekeeping missions are a part would be crucial in laying the foundations for sustainable peace as well. Addressing the next point is about addressing persistent vulnerability, which we have seen in different contexts. And this is where we see a lot of the centering of violence on the margins rather than on the center of political activity. And here, UN peacekeeping missions are increasingly deployed in contexts where the war to peace transitions struggle in exercising effective territoriality. It would be impossible, in fact, to build a sustainable peace if within the context where UN peacekeeping operations operate, the national government has effective control of less than 2/3 of its national territory, ceding most of its territory, in fact, to non-state armed groups and other spoilers. What are the policy implications of these 5 analytical dilemmas? The first is the necessity to navigate growing complexities, meaning that there has to be space at the interstices between human security and climate security, between transnational organized crime and harder security engagements as well. And this is underneath the broader political umbrella that UN missions deliver. There's the necessity to act nationally and think regionally, and I dare say even globally, and here David actually spoke to that in his liminal remarks. And there is the need for flexibility and adaptability of multidimensional mandates in rather fluid context. I realize that these are easier said from the space of a researcher than done from the space of challenges to peacekeeping troops and the leadership of peacekeeping missions as well. However, our role it is to actually think through the optimal possibilities and engage in a conversation about how those can be delivered. David, I will take my leave here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a robust conversation. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, and I think really fascinating points that you've added to the discussion, especially your 5 dilemmas, which I must say are certainly things which we need to grapple with, both in terms of peacekeeping and, as you were putting it, the more broader regional approaches which we need to undertake, which ultimately means the UN working with partnerships and a range of different actors. And this, of course, is something which comes up very clearly in the Secretary General's new agenda for peace as well. So I think we have an important space in which we can begin to think about how to more systematically address the 5 dilemmas that you outlined.
A question or comment at this stage? If you would raise your hand, I'll try to direct the microphone. I see one there and also one here. So I'll come to this side of the room first, please, sir, you, and then...
Thank you very much, sir. My name is Major General Selva Kayemba. I am the military advisor of Uganda at the Permanent Mission in New York. I would like to add my voice to those who appreciated the good reception received from our host. And I want to thank them further because when it comes to protection of civilians, they have always been at the forefront. I was here when we were developing the Kigali principles that we are trying to practice, and this takes us a step forward. I want to observe this, that this preparatory conference is in line with what will ultimately come out in Ghana, where we are expected to play. And my mind says that it should be said that when you are breaking troops or facilities in Ghana, please bear in mind these challenges that you are due to face. That's how I want to begin. Now, the troops that are going to place are going to face an arena that has evolved. And when you say evolved, from what to what? The colleague from Bangladesh tried to show us, but I will put it this way. Peacekeeping has evolved from analog to digital. If you think you are going to come and perform in this arena using the analog formula, you may get it wrong. This is how I understand it here. Why? You will find, therefore, that while we had a lot of diplomacy in the beginnings of peacekeeping, where we had diplomacy solving problems because we had warring parties that could be held accountable, today it is not possible. Therefore, if you think you are going to deploy fully observing the 3 cardinal principles of peacekeeping, you may not find them there. This is how I see it, and that's how I wish to give the correct information to my colleagues, particularly those that dress like me. The situation is different. You are not going to get the consent from the warring parties. You are not going to use minimum force except for self-defense. and deliver the mandate. So this is where we are. Otherwise, there is a terminology that was being fronted a lot of recent, which was being for caveats. Then you are going to come in with caveats. Thereby, you will be contributing to numbers, not to peace. But we expect you to come and contribute to peace. I will stop at this. I will give more when we come to this protection of civilians, but thank you very much. I thought I would express my understanding and see if the other shades are here. Thank you very much.
My name is Mohammed. I am the Deputy Head of Mission at the Egyptian Embassy here in Kigali. So I'm not a specialist in this topic, unfortunately, but as a diplomat, I'm just wondering about the capacity building of the local authorities in the state, in the host state or in the host country. How are we going to focus on this, or how are we going to enhance the capacity building of the host state or country? Because as you mentioned in your discussions or insights, well, the peacekeeping forces are not staying forever in the country. So somebody has to take over at some point. So that's my question. And I also have a proposal, because in Egypt we have what we call Cairo map. That was a Cairo roadmap that was adopted in 2020 by the African Union. And that Cairo roadmap, adopted in 2020 by the African Union, was aiming at enhancing the implementation of action for peacekeeping. And what's so important about it, or what's special about it, is that it provides clear KPIs, or clear key performance indicators that would help us to implement that action. So as you know, in management, the important rule says, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. So that's why I just want to highlight on the importance of adopting clear KPIs, like the ones mentioned or included in the action for peacekeeping, Cairo roadmap in 2020. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Italy to Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi. Actually, I would like to start from one of the remarks of the ASG, Kobe. She was rightly saying that there's a fragmentation of in this evolving, let's say, context, there's a fragmentation of actors and authorities, which makes, of course, things much more difficult, especially in this region, where actually where I operate with my countries. But the main issue remains, and the Colonel was before mentioning an issue which is very much important, the increase of casualties of civilian victims. And that's, I think, the main issue that we have to face nowadays when we talk, unfortunately, about MINUSCA or MINUSMA. That failure comes from, in reality, a double problem. The first one is marketing. We don't communicate with the local authorities. We don't communicate with local populations. We don't protect them. And that's one of the main issues that every time I have discussion with the military representatives from three countries, from Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, of course, they are, by the way, stressing before the colleague from Uganda, they gave the main contingent to Amisom before, and that means now Rwanda is in Mozambique and eventually in the Central African Republic. That he was mentioning again, the civilian increase in terms of victims. That's a precise strategy that creates waves of refugees which are meant to undermine the neighboring countries. And everything that it is, there's a precise, actually, civilian increase victim strategy that is very much implemented. If we don't address, that's my take, but of course I would like your perspective on that, if we don't address this specific issue, any possible future peacekeeping operation would be, in terms of reputation, at stake. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think three important and somewhat interrelated points from the distinguished delegates of Uganda, Egypt, and Italy. On the question of being ready to act robustly, on the issue of how to deal with
with civilian casualties and the targeting of civilian by armed groups, and also on the larger question of measuring performance. I will now pass back to the panel, and I'll start with you, Colonel, and see if you would like to pick up. I think there was also a point about state capacities and security sector reform that you might want to touch on as well.
Thank you. Regarding the first question, the capacity building of the local authorities. Since the inception of multi-dimensional peacekeeping, there are basically three components: military, police, and civilians. Along with that, even every mission, they have their UN country teams. So they have a perspective plan how to build the capacity building of the local authorities. So they make it like different sectors like security sector reform, electorals, judiciary, education, health sector. These all sectors are taken into account, and in the integrated approach by both military, police and civilians, and also taking due support from the UN country team, these are duly addressed. If we take the example of Liberia, then Cote d'Ivoire, we have a successful footprint that UN could establish sustainable security sector reform and also the capacity building of the local authorities. The second issue that I'll briefly touch upon regarding the increased civilian casualties. In the recent past, UN has introduced, because I'm from military perspective, I'll explain, because we do deal with the tactical level engagement. And from the recent past, the DPO, they have introduced the engagement concept of the engagement. Also, we have, once we have an area of responsibility, we have different community alert, community network assistant, community liaison assistance, community alert network. There is an impending threat for the civilian communities. Around the fatalities on the civilians. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colonel. And I just want to link this before going on to the panel to the question of performance and use of data to measure performance. That I think the distinguished delegate of Egypt touched upon. One of the things which our opening speaker, the Director of Security Policy from the Netherlands, raised was the CPAS system. This is an attempt to help missions use the data that they have in order to measure performance. And the Colonel mentioned the community alert networks. So the SRSG, Madam Bintu Keita of the mission in MONUSCO, actually asked, how can we measure the level of response which a mission is giving? And they were able actually to see that even though in the Eastern DRC, the number of alerts from the community had gone up by about 40%, the mission was still responding at the same high rate, responding to a larger number of alerts from more members of the community, so doing more work with the same resources. So I think sometimes data like that can actually illuminate that even though it's a very difficult situation, the mission may be very actively working on POC and responding to community needs. And thank you also for your points about security sector reform. Maybe I'll pass to you, Dr. Akoum, on any of the points that you want to touch upon, and pass it to you. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. The first point I will touch upon is basically the future of peace operations spaces being inherently digital. There is sort of a transcendental way to look at that, beyond just the peacekeeping component, but also the political component. Because in the ways in which because of the ways in which diaspora communities also play roles in shaping strategic communications around specific peacekeeping spaces. So it would be important to look at it as a technological issue, as a political issue, but also as a peacekeeping issue. The second issue I would like to talk to is basically the issue about protection of civilians or security sector reform as well. On this question, I think we need to raise the issue of accountability as well. and accountability mechanisms that actually allow for justice to be rendered in cases where there have been violations and abuses of civilian populations. We cannot just stop at the level of protecting civilians. We also have to push the reflection beyond protection to accountability and ways in which accountability could be used as a dissuasive mechanism for non-state armed groups in targeting civilian populations. In terms of tracking and key performance indicators for peacekeeping operations, that reflection has to extend beyond just peacekeeping operations to political and development outcomes as well. Because we've got to ask important questions about the kinds of societies that are emerging as a result of these peacekeeping operations in terms of inclusion, the participation of youth and women, and the possibility of extending full territorial control of the specific countries that are being supported. Those could be included in the KPIs, while at the same time creating measures which unfortunately would not be too easy, which basically raise the bar of measurement as part of the process. And that said, not everything that happens in these spaces can be measured, so we have to have a degree of flexibility on acknowledging that which can be measured and that which escapes measure as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Before passing to the ASG, could I come back and ask you, in your vision that you just described of KPIs, let's say, that would try to look at not just protection, but political progress, etc., would you ascribe those to be things which would need to be shared between the peacekeeping operation and the host state? In the sense that some of those really are not in the hands of a peacekeeping mission alone, maybe probably not even primarily in the hands of the peacekeeping mission. I wanted to just ask you that.
Well, I mean, David, I think you answered your own question, right? Because the onus for autonomy, authority, and legitimacy starts and ends with host countries. And the United Nations is there to basically provide the kind of political and security-based support that legitimate governments need to drive processes. So there is shared responsibility with a majority of the responsibility resting with host countries. Thanks.
Thank you. ASG, over to you on any of those points which you would like to touch on.
Yes, thank you. Very, very brief. On the issue, I think, on accountability that I think has been mentioned here, clearly it's very important, and the point has been made about the role of the host authorities. I think that we all agree the primary responsibility for protecting civilians in any country is the government, and I think our presence there has always ensured that we're supportive of that through various means. And I think that part of the reason why we have a very strong political aspect of the mandate is the political engagement, is to enable the mission through the good officer's role of the SRSG, of all the other elements, to keep contact with governments politically and urge them see what the lack is, so that the UN, working very closely, of course, with the partners, and here I'd like to mention the excellent partnership we have with the EU, with some bilateral donors, in trying to address the gaps that may exist in any particular context. The question about how we ensure that we build capacity of the host country to ensure there are no gaps after we've left, and how we are supporting them. This is a critical function that our missions have sorted. I think the earlier responses have gone to show some of the areas where we work in SSR, DDR, and so on. So these are important things, the multidimensional, the integrated nature of our engagement in any context, in any mission, working closely with the other arms of the UN, the presence of the UN in that country, go to try to ensure that we are tackling as broadly as possible all the other factors, because realizing it's not just the armed solution or military solution, but it goes with a whole lot of other factors. And we have to do this in a holistic way, you know, to make a real impact and dent on how the society, the community looks at the UN. And I think in a number of settings, we're trying to do that. In MINUSCA, relating in a real sense with the communities, in providing some of the needs that they need, building the community coherence, avoiding those conflicts that we can avoid even at the very local level. So I just wanted to add this to what has been very eloquently expressed earlier in the response. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Can I also come back to you on a kind of conundrum, which is, I think you rightly just described the kind of importance role in terms of helping host authorities and even communities build resilience, whether it's institutional or social resilience to conflict. But of course, that takes a long time. When we look back in the evolving context of peacekeeping, which the Colonel began with, some of those earlier missions, the mission went in, we got to an election, we left. But the lessons of longer-term peace building meant that we had broader mandates that went for longer. Extend the authority of the state is a potentially 10, 20-year activity, given, for example, the challenge of doing that in the Central African Republic. Do you see a tension between peacekeeping's presence for shorter political transitions versus some of these longer-term security, institution building, and community orientation? How do you resolve that? How do you not overstay your welcome?
Very interesting question, David. And I think part of what we're seeing in the DRC with what sometimes, the perception we've been there for a long time, we need to go. There's been a transition process that was supposed to really ensure that the drawdown is on the basis of, it's conditions-based, it's not just time-based. And also dealing with, the real sense that if we leave earlier than we should and the conditions are not met, what happens in the next 6 months? Are we coming back? I think these are real things that we have to look at. I'm currently just thinking of MINUSMA. And already, even in the drawdown process, we see there's fighting. The peace agreement, to all intents and purposes, is not holding. And there are the expectation that the regional or the regional entities or the international parts of the international community that are supposed to engage on the implementation of the agreement, the guarantors of the peace agreement, are also facing challenges with the host authorities in terms of the Malians saying, we are okay, we're going to handle this, but we still see the problem. Mm-hmm. And there isn't anything tangible yet on the ground to safeguard the peace agreement. And the conflict, as we draw down, is also on the uptick. So there is a challenge there. Solutions-wise, we are not there yet. We're seeing how we can do this from the good officers' role, which the UN continuously engages. So as MINUSMA leaves, you have UNOWAS that tries to step in to ensure that we can keep the dialogue going. But of course, we require the support of the international community in this, the Security Council in this. And I think that there has been some engagement, some messaging from the Council to that effect. But this is the problem we have. And I've talked about Somalia. It's another, because AU says it's moving out, ATMIS is leaving end of 2024, but is Somalia ready with the security transition that is expected to take place to ensure that the gains made, we don't go back on those, that we can guarantee a minimum security within which even our own entities supporting the Somali people can continue to have that footprint in the country. So it's a question that remains a challenge, but we have to see how globally we try to deal with this. Of course, working with those countries that have influence on certain countries, trying to support us in that role, in sending that message that we need to work together with the understanding that the UN is there to support, the UN is there to assist, and it is not the entity that we should be at loggerheads with the member states. I think this is an important thing that we are trying to push in all of these difficulties.
Thank you. I see from the body language of my colleagues that maybe they want to come in on these points. Colonel, did you want to come in?
Just in consonance to the Assistant Secretary General's her perspective, I want to explain it further from a military commander's perspective, the challenges that we are facing in the most important task of protection of civilian. Like the consent-based approach, the UN is tasked. Now, if we take the example of Mali, many a times that we are denied of taking some information, getting some information. But what the locals they are saying, or the civilians they are saying, that UN is in between them, and UN is continuously failing to ensure their protection. Where the UN is denied to use that particular airspace, UN is denied to use that particular area for ground operation. So this is a challenge of new dimension as regards to the protection of civilians, and where the credibility of UN peacekeepers are seriously questioned. So we need to make this point that how in this type of situation, taking the example of Mali, how we are going to address the most important mandated task of protection of civilian. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Dr. Akum?
So to complement those responses, our research in Mali and the Central African Republic outside of urban spaces pointed to inherent tensions between the extension of the authority of the state and an extension of the utility of the state. Because often tensions and extension of the authority of the state are basically at the root of some of the tensions with certain local communities. And in spaces where land matters, in spaces where land is the source of farmer-herder conflict, we have to interrogate the extension of the authority of the state slightly differently. Second, in spaces where the state is not present, the negotiation of its utility becomes very important, because communities have to make choices between engaging and negotiating with non-state armed groups as a means to protect themselves, their income-generating activities, and their families, but to also provide a way of social climbing. So how do we break that cord between communities in that position of vulnerability as a pathway, in fact, to marginalizing non-state armed groups, and then getting the state to actually provide those basic services? So beyond capacity, there's a question of capabilities there as well, which needs to be centralized in the reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. Capability, capacity, and it sounds also legitimacy at some level too. Very interesting points. Let me come back to the room and see if anybody would like to join the conversation. If you would, please do put your hand up. Yes, I see a gentleman there. I'm not sure who carries the microphone at the moment, if they could help us. Microphone on this side, please. Yeah, it's in the middle. If you put your hand up again, sir, so you can see you. Thanks.
Thank you, Moderator. It's a comment as well as a question. First of all, I'd like to thank you for setting the tone of today's discussion, and also three panelists for excellent deliberation. I was carefully listening to the discussions, as it is very important topic, the trends, evolving trends of peacekeeping operations. My question is about the confidence of the state authorities. As you have already mentioned that the host authority is a very important component of the UN peacekeeping operations. As Her Excellency referred to this matter twice, that the confidence of the host authority is diminishing. My question is, what are the driving factors? Why they are not confident enough, or they cannot put trust on UN peacekeeping operations? is it because of alternative force on the ground? Because we have heard a lot of discussion around alternative force in Mali. Is it the post or Cold War period bloc mentality of the states, or is it the sense of strong sovereignty? Is it like considering the peacekeeping mission as a kind of like stigma to the national authority not being able to manage the things? So I started without introducing myself. My name is Mahbur Rahman, and I'm from Bangladesh. I'm director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I thank all panelists, of course, Colonel Tariq from Bangladesh, who has very good experience on the ground. So I thank you.
Yeah, I was testing, sorry. Jean-Christophe Demers from Canada, the Department of National Defense. Thank you for your presentation. It's very enlightening. I have a question that's a little bit more fundamental, I guess, and it could be just my fault for not reading enough material of what's already published and available by various research centers that work with the UN closely. But my question largely is who determines what is a civilian, and is there a reflection on the evolution of what being a civilian in conflicts where peacekeeping operations are deployed? And the context for that question is that there has been a lot of discussions on the evolution of peace support operations and their mandate, their objectives, their spirit over time, and I've read plenty of material on this too. I think the presentations were very accurate if I refer to what I've seen so far, and I mean, cross-referencing those reflections are or is the status of a civilian. For instance, two concrete examples. One would be situations which I have heard of and which I've witnessed in documentaries of combatants in Mali. Passing as civilians, so literally dispersing into the woods and hiding, ditching their weapons to then join back communities. Are those civilians or are those enemy combatants? What is the perspective of how can we collectively and the nations that are involved in peace support operations distinguish between our will to protect civilians in a very broad and humanist understanding of what civilians are, and at the same time fulfill our mandate, which is to bridge situations of conflicts and war and situations of peace and development. Another example would be situations in which governments, and I'm not going to name any, are exerting violence towards their civilians, whereas we have, or the UN can only have a mandate to stay in the host country if the host country gives its consent to the UN to stay, which means that there's also a reflection to be had there as to how much do we want to enforce our vision of what a civilian is versus what we are willing to accept in terms of a compromise in terms of what the host nation is defining as a civilian. So I was just wondering basically what the definitions are, and if you have anything to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important question. I have one more hand I'm seeing in the back there. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Karen Chalian, Ambassador of Russia to Rwanda. But allow me to speak as a former peacekeeper, not as an ambassador. I've been a peacekeeper for 22 years, and all of them in the bush. Thank God, not in New York or Geneva. So, in my experience, and I'm going to say this a number of times, you know, the credibility and trust that a mission possesses in a given country cannot really be managed. It's something that either you have or you don't. With all respect for communications, strategic communications, misinformation, disinformation, we can come to that later, but first of all, missions should not be too ambitious in their goals. We've all heard about the concept of the Christmas tree mission, so I'll not talk about that. And I was present in peacekeeping when that was happening. And the logic was, you're a $2 billion mission, you're there on the ground, so why don't you do this and this and this and this? And in the end, all the priorities would get mixed up. And you wouldn't know what's more important, political and civil affairs and DDR, or some obscure fields of endeavor, which I don't want to name. And the same applies to capacity building, by the way. I wonder to what extent a mission can do capacity building, whether it should really feature as a prominent part of a peacekeeping mission mandate. I still think that's more for the Blue UN. Now, the lack of success, or the success or lack of success in a peacekeeping mission is not caused by deficiencies in strategic communications, but by a lack of results. A lack of results in implementing the mission mandate. We can dress up a situation in a report, in a Secretary General's report, any way we want. But people on the ground and people who know will know whether we have been successful in the past 6 months or 12 months, depending on the reporting cycle, or not. You know, there is an extent to which we can embellish, as it were. So the perception of a mission is conditioned on results, on success, and the local population knows that. The host government knows that. And it would be very difficult to change that. Now, the questions need to be asked, for example, as to why the mission in Central Africa has been successful up until now, and when the mission in Mali has not been successful. And that needs to be said. By the way, there was something here said about a constant or a prolonged presence in a given country, which can only solidify the existing negative state of affairs. I would imagine that the government and people of Mali were expecting the UN mission to do something about the main problem that faced Mali, which is the situation in the north. And when that did not happen, both the people and the government became impatient, not only with the UN mission, but with the whole spectrum of Western missions. By the way, I noticed that Operation Barhan was not mentioned. Now, a mission should never oppose the host government, never, either politically or in terms of messaging. Because if that happens, the mission has run out of road completely. Going against the host government in major areas of mission endeavor is a recipe for disaster. That's been shown many times. It's interesting that the successful peacekeeping missions were those where the P5 worked together. That's Cambodia, Angola, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire. Definitely not so in Yugoslavia, where many questions have not been resolved. And as you know, Haiti was completely left to the P3, and it was not a great success. Again, we have to ask ourselves why. There's been any amount of strategic communications over Haiti and over other missions. We need to have an inventory of what has actually worked in peacekeeping, starting from Boutros Ghali's first report, An Agenda for Peace, which laid the foundation of modern peacekeeping, then to Brahimi. then to Hippo, then to what came later, 7 or 8 or 10 other reports which more or less said the same thing. Now, why so many reports? What has worked? What hasn't worked? Unfortunately, that's not too clear. And we can continue generating these reports, but if we don't make this inventory, I don't know how successful we're going to be. And another thing is, of course, the intense politicization of peacekeeping. This is one of those things that was killing us. It was killing us in Sudan. I spent 11 years in Sudan, in the Nuba Mountains and in Darfur. And the politicization was horrific. It was not only our relations with the host government that would have been difficult enough. We had problems with the UN Secretariat, we had problems with Geneva, we had problems with major capitals. And with all these August quarters pulling in different directions, I think that this contributed in a major way to what we see today in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and also to you, Karen, as a former colleague. Lots of interesting points. I had one colleague there, and then I'll come to you, and we may need, I think we're supposed to wrap this up at 1:30, so we may need to wrap it there so I can come.
Mine is a quick one, and is about requesting you to enlighten us about weaponizing misinformation and disinformation. And here I am talking about this apart from the psychological and toxic negative effects to the local population and the whole communities affecting the peace process. How else is it weaponized? I wanted that light to be enlighten us, please. Then number two, the ambassador from Russia has highlighted about it, but I want to bring it this way. Whereas we appreciate the UN efforts in peacekeeping, because there has to be an effort. That's step number one. And whereas I am mindful of the political environments at play in different countries, where I feel that the base, the adaptability and flexibility of the UN member states in reacting to peace is a bit slow. I don't know whether it's as a result of whether UN is overwhelmed by the numerous conflicts that are going on. I don't know how you look into at your level to see how something new, a re-engineering of how it can be improved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was one more.
Insightful interventions. My question is on the global political landscape has really had a huge impact on peacekeeping since the tradition era to today. I just want to hear from you, what's your thought on the future of peacekeeping missions in face of the current changing global political landscape, where digitalization has taken a forefront? Thank you. Maybe my question would be addressed to our researcher or any of the panelists. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. We'll definitely turn to Dr. Akum for that. So our last questioner here in the blue suit, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm retired Kanoji Rutaremara from Rwanda. You alluded to the issue of the challenge of geographical limitation, and one of the speakers also hinted on community resilience. Now my question is there any good practice or best practice or even practices that we can share when it comes to the role of UN in building community resilience or local protection measures when it comes to civilians. And as you answer this, I hope you will bear in mind that sometimes both the state and non-state actors can be perpetrators when it comes to violation of these rights.
We will have other panels, of course, and I think some of these issues undoubtedly will weave in and out of them, so we don't necessarily need to answer all of them if indeed they are answerable, all of them. But I will now pass maybe in reverse order and go to you, ASG, first, to ask you to pick up whichever you like of those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you rightly said, I think, the very rich questions, and I'm really pleased the frankness with which these contributions have come from around the room. It's very helpful for us to use this opportunity for that deep dive, exactly what we were expecting. I will not attempt to answer the questions, but just pick on a couple of them, because I think that in the next 2 days, in the different panels, we should have the opportunity to explore these further. But the question regarding the confidence of host government in UN peacekeeping, I think has been touched upon in one of the other contributors from the floor. Really, I think there's a gap between what the UN is mandated to do and the expectations also of the host government. There's clearly a gap. For different factors may account for that. But just to give one example, if I may, in Mali, we saw that clearly the level of robustness of the force is what the Malians saying it's not tackling, protecting the civilians or tackling the threats, the real threats to peace and security in that country, particularly in the north. And how that we are unable to support them to do just that. And so you should also take that within the context of that country having gone through 2 successive coups d'etats and the kind of political angle at which the de facto government is also operating, working with the mission. So there have been challenges as a political transition, the regional dimension comes into play in terms of even the relationship with the regional ECOWAS. So there are a number of factors, and I think that the relationship got to that stage where we are today. But clearly, there's a question that member states of the UN need to ask and to find answers to. The organization is as strong as the member states make it, peacekeeping being an important diplomatic tool that we have under the Charter. How do we enhance that? How do we make sure that we are relevant to member states on the ground, and what capacities, what mandates that are given to peacekeepers to be able to meet the expectations of not just the government, but I think that another important factor we have to look at is the people themselves. So within the communities, the communication, getting them to understand what it's all about, the peacekeeping, the limitations, what we can do, what we cannot do. These are very important questions that I think as an organization we have to delve into. I mentioned in one of my responses the fact that working as one UN, so a mission is there in the field, but there is a country presence, and the country team can play specific roles to complement that of the mission. And how do we do this more effectively to ensure that the perceptions of the local populations are also, we can touch on all the other issues that come to play in a particular setting. So very complex, not so easy to navigate, but I think that these are good questions that as an organization we would need to tackle. So I hope that in the subsequent sessions, in the discussions, we'll have the opportunity to explore some of the other questions that are very pertinent for this event.
Thank you.
Thank you, ASG. Over to you, Dr. Akum.
Thank you. Complex questions. In terms of trust between government and or declining trust in UN missions, it depends on duration seems to play a role. The politics, local politics matters, of course, and results matter. I'd leave it at that, and we could unfurl those. In terms of the question about G5, respectfully, I think it's a conversation that goes beyond just approving new peacekeeping missions and mandates, and hits to the core of the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations itself. A position which the African Union has taken about the necessity to actually reform the Security Council. And I'll observe here that based on research done by the Multilateralism Index by our colleagues at the International Peace Institute, multilateralism is in crisis in reaching consensus around political and security issues, but less so on issues relating to climate and development, for example. So how do you actually break that gridlock? You've got to look at the instrument and the space within which that gridlock takes place, which is the Security Council. And a reform of the Security Council would provide opportunities to rise beyond the polarization between the P3 and the P2. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Colonel, over to you.
About the ascertaining who is civilian or who is not the civilian, this is a very simple question, but very difficult to answer in the context of UN environment. According to the law of armed conflict, anybody who is not engaged directly in war, he is a civilian. But let me draw an example from one of the contingent commanders. Once he was conducting a patrol, he was fired upon. It was a harassing fire, not a targeted fire. So chasing that targeted fire, he found he is not an armed group terrorist. He is a local dacoit, earns his livelihood with these arms, and he was definitely not in possession of arms. So this is the complexity that the peacekeepers need to address. So he is not my opposing force that just capturing him or neutralizing him, my success will be defined. So these are the complex scenario that we need to deal. It's very difficult once a civilian having arms, leave his arms, and he becomes a civilian. So that's the issue that you have been asking. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'll abuse the position of moderator just to touch on a couple of the other points. There was the point about an alternate offer and whether countries are reaching for an alternate offer. I mean, obviously, sovereign states can reach for security partnerships as they wish, but I would just reflect on the fact that the UN is a collective security organization. And so if there isn't a strong collective understanding as to what a mission is doing and what it's offering, and support from all the member states operationally using their political leverage on the ground behind that mission, it's unlikely to succeed. And I think that's true of any of the UN responses, because what we're describing in terms of challenges of consent are happening to special political missions, they're happening to envoys, and I think that this goes back to the core questions about where that political support is. Interestingly, peacekeeping as an instrument, I find, continues to have very strong political support. It's actually when you come to the particular application of the UN's role in a given political context where we find the challenges. And that's why I think that when you scratch at a mission in crisis, you will find right beneath the surface a crisis of a political nature. And an alternative offer sometimes just represents precisely that lack of consensus and division. And then just the other point I wanted to quickly touch on is, where is peacekeeping going in the future? I mean, I think there is a lot of room for us to discuss that, and the new agenda for peace will be an opportunity. But I think one of the directions which I would like to suggest, it goes back to the fact that we're seeing a very wide range of different operational deployments as we look around this continent and elsewhere. And so in fact, I think probably it's probably not right to put your hand on one box and say that is the future. I think we probably need a diversity of tools which can work to more systematically operationalize regional responses or multinational force responses or UN peace operation responses, which themselves need to be more nimble and agile. So with that, I would like to ask you all to turn and give our panelists a hand of appreciation, and also yourselves for all of your great comments. And over to you, Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you very much, David, and the distinguished panel for your excellent discussions this morning. Please, you may take your seats. So the next item on the agenda is lunch. We'll be back at 1500 hours for the next session on protection of civilians. Protocol, please guide our guests for lunch at the tent. And thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch. Bon appetit.